Thanks, Trey, and thanks to you all for being here. This is my third time visiting Christendom. The first time I think was in 2012, where I spoke in a much smaller building than this one. But I was here this summer on this very stage, talking about beauty, and there are two things I like to talk about the most. It's the philosophy of beauty and then the practice of poetry. So since I just did the last one in June, you're going to get the second. And before I continue, I'm aware that we'll be taking questions afterwards, and so I would just, out of your sense of good Christian charity and politeness, to please abstain making any reference to the Cubs and their record, including how the game may go or has gone today, because I watch the games before bed at night, and so spoilers would be a great cause of grief to me and to all of your family. With that modest threat of violence out of the way, maybe we'll think a little bit about some poems. So I have more that I would like to share with you than I can share with you in the course of one evening. So maybe you'll come back for more sometime. But and I don't know what, in fact, is going to come out of my mouth just yet. I've got plenty of stuff here to talk about, and I'm just going to see which aspect of it grabs me the most. I just last night with my Master of Fine Arts students, we were talking about Sir Philip Sidney's famous defense of poetry. I don't know, has anybody read that? A few of you, yeah. And there's a moment early in that treatise, which is one of the first modern works of literary criticism, that says that verse is the apparel of poetry, an ornament, a gown. So it's versus the clothing of poetry. Well, what's the body? This is not a Dorothy Sayers mystery. What's the body that's beneath the gown? And Sidney has his answer, which is a poor but honest attempt to interpret Aristotle, that it's creating a golden world, a kind of plot and a story in a world that's not this one, but that reflects the realities of this one in some way. But in that same paragraph where he makes this claim that poetry is a mere apparel, ornament, and garment or gown versus a mere those things of poetry, he says, there have indeed been plenty of poets who never wrote a verse, and plenty of versifiers who are not poets. It is a warning that we should all take seriously, that when someone makes what sounds like a generic distinction, that is to say, dividing a genus up into two species, but where you definitely don't want to fall in one of the categories, they're up to something. My friend Ked Woodward published an article a couple of years ago on Christian nationalism, and he said something like, Christian nationalism is a label pasted on you. It's not one to which anyone actually answers. I don't think anybody in the history of poetry said, oh, I'm one of those versifiers, right? So this was clearly a pejorative remark on Sidney's part. Sidney was doing his best to interpret that first and most famous work of the philosophy of poetry, Aristotle's Poetics, and I think he was just doing a poor job of interpreting it there, and created thereby, what would we say, a little bit of an opening in Pandora's box. Ever since then, there have been those who will say, you're not really a poet, you're a versifier. But that kind of raises a question, doesn't it? As the poet J.V. Cunningham once put it, when you go to the bookstore to buy a book of poetry as a graduation present for someone soon to depart from high school to college, you go and pick out an anthology that's full of poems that are written in verse. You don't buy the cantos of Ezra Pound. That was really supposed to get elicit laughter. Like what? I mean, those of you who have ever seen Ezra Pound's cantos, think of what a curse that would be to give that to somebody as a present. it's like the middle finger, you know. The cantos are actually quite interesting, but again, probably not. There's a time and a place for everything, and a high school graduation is not the place to say what the hell is Ezra Pound saying in this book. So, yes. So you go and find something that's full of finely wrought lines that everyone from your grandma B to your cousin Mickey would recognize as a poem. That's the appropriate gift for a graduation party. In other words, it marks no difference between versifiers and poets. To versify is to write poetry. To write poetry is to versify. So says Cunningham. At the end of the essay from which that little anecdote about going to the bookstore comes, he tells us that his definition of poetry is composition in verse. Not a bad answer, but also one that seems to me to be prone to a few vulnerabilities. Cunningham himself introduces one. He says, this is not a very satisfactory and satisfying definition of poetry, composition in verse, but it's the only one that will fit everything that is the case. And so we have to go with sort of the bare minimum if we're going to define poetry rather than aiming somewhere else. When I first came across this, it reminded me of that great anecdote of Diogenes breaking up the class in Plato's Academy, where they were all sitting about trying to come up with definitions of things, including how do you define man? And you may recall someone proposed that the best definition of man is a featherless biped. And so Diogenes, who I guess was known as quite a wag, showed up a week or so later, entering the room with a plucked chicken and set it free into the academy and said, "There's your man." It has always seemed to me as if Cunningham's definition, while having a certain sturdiness and certainly getting something right, is a little bit like like the plucked chicken definition of poetry. It defines something that, the featherless biped definition of poetry. It grasps something of the truth, but it doesn't feel exhaustive. Well, as you know, eventually the ancient Greeks came to a pretty satisfactory definition of mankind, that man is a rational animal. But how did they arrive at such a definition? They did not do it by looking at their cousin Charlie and saying he's really smart. Poor Charlie could hardly crack a coconut open, you know? Whoever he was, right? I remember the poet Louis MacNeice, in one of the great poems of his from the book he wrote with W.H. Auden, Letters from Iceland, he speaks of Aristotle's definition of man as the rational animal. And he replies with a fell laugh, "How nice it would be to be born a man." You know, very few of us are particularly rational. So how did Aristotle arrive at such a seemingly ludicrous definition? Well, he didn't look at us as we are. He looked at us as we become when we are acting fully and properly, when we are actualized. In other words, he was thinking teleologically. He was looking not to the mere material facts of things as we find them, but to the ordering and final principle around which or to which those materials of being were ordered. If we do that with poetry, we discover that neither the Sidney division of poetry and verse, nor the featherless biped definition of poetry of Cunningham are really quite adequate. That we can actually say a great deal more about poetry, and by saying more, we don't overly complicate and render unhelpful our definition. We actually get at something that I think everybody will agree with, and yet still accounts for everything that is the case, just as Cunningham was aiming to do. In the ancient world, there was a very clear sense of what poetry was, despite the fact that Aristotle caused some problems for Philip Sidney and others down the road. And let me just throw it out to you, because I have some sense of your core curriculum here. When you, students of Christendom, hear that something is a work of poetry, or you hear of the work of poetry, the art of poetry, what author or authors do you think of? Diogenes, you're here. A good start. I'll come back to Dr. Seuss. Tolkien, and I heard something else. Dante. Do I hear somebody saying Homer, but who said it twice, but somebody's always speaking over you? Is this how it is at home too? Yeah. I get it. Yeah. What else? Frost, yes. Good. Shakespeare. Good. There was another thing that I couldn't make out. It sounded like Antonio Machado. So, okay, yes. All right, there we go. Thought it was somebody killed my father. I'm not prepared to die, but I'm noticing my comments have been very morbid tonight. That's two so far. Better go think about something. So I may come back and ask that question, or a variant on that question again before we're done. But I think you can imagine in the ancient world, the first answer would have probably been Homer. It would have had to have been. And from Homer, we get a sense of something that poetry does. It tells story. It tells it recited to the lyre, and so in a meter that's suitable for musical performance. Does more than that, but that's the beginning of things. We could look to the same culture that was indeed a Homeric culture of the ancient Greeks. We say if they weren't reading Homer, they were going to the amphitheater and hearing tragedies performed. And we have therefore, we find there a similar phenomenon. The tragedy also told stories, but in a different medium, or in a different form. The plot was restructured to conform to the stage, but at the level of language, the medium was the same, meter. If we think about what poetry did in that age, we will soon discern 4 conspicuous features. And Homer makes this most obvious, but the ancient dramatists convey it as well. By the way, I came down with a cold yesterday, so if I make it through this lecture only using 2 tissues, that's a win, okay? But I am going to be interrupting things from time to time to take care of myself here. I want to start with to move towards the definition of poetry based upon how the ancient world thought of these things in the following way. Well, first, the conspicuous features, I want to just re-enumerate them, of epic and drama would be that they were narrative, that they were metrical, that they were mnemonic, that is to say they were memorable, and that they were public and performative. Okay, good description of what they were doing. But how can that lead us towards a definition? Let's take a little sidetrack to figure out how to go about defining things with Plato. I'm sure many of you, perhaps all of you, read the symposium here at Christendom. And you'll know that late in the symposium, Socrates is asked to make his speech on the nature of love. And after some preliminary dialectic with Agathon, he tells us of an encounter he had with a priestess by the name of Diotima. And here is some of Diotima's speech to Socrates as she's trying to tell him the truth about love. Well, you know, for example, that poetry, poiesis, has a very wide range. After all, everything that is responsible for creating something out of nothing is a kind of poetry. And so all the creations of every craft and profession are themselves a kind of poetry. And everyone who practices a craft is a poet. Nevertheless, as you also know, these craftsmen are not called poets. We have other words for them: carpenters, architects, and so on and so forth. And out of the whole of poetry, poiesis, making, we have marked off only one part, the part the Muses give us, with melody and rhythm, and we refer to this by the word that means the whole. For this alone is called poetry, and those who practice this part of poetry are called poets. So in context, what Diotima is trying to teach Socrates is how to think analogically. The word poetry refers to, or poiesis in Greek, just refers to the act of making, and so anything made is an act of, or a work of poiesis, whether it's a table, a chair, a toothbrush, or a building. But, she says, for some reason, and her answer to the reason, or explanation of the reason is contained in her remarks here, for some reason, we've marked off one kind of making as to take the title poiesis, while all the rest are called things like carpentry, architecture, and shoemaking, and so on and so forth. Why is this? Well, the beginning of an answer is in the phrase from which my title comes. We have marked out one part of making, the part the Muses give us. This is a great insight. What Diotima is pointing out to Socrates is that there's something about the particular act of making that's particular to the art of poetry that stands out and seems in some way to set it apart from all the other kinds of making, such that it takes the crown. It gets to be the one that uses the name poiesis, whereas everything else has another name. And I think the answer to why it takes that crown lies in that phrase, the part the Muses give us. In the act of making a poem, or in the act of receiving a poem as its audience, we sense that for all the craft and technique and care that may go into its construction, the most well-laid plans, the most careful handiwork will not be sufficient to qualify it as a good work. There must be some element that seems to come from elsewhere. In other words, in the art of poetry, we sense that craft and technique, this active, conscious, I'm going to repeat myself here, activity on the part of the poet, has to be supplemented or fused with a receptive, helpless, gracious acceptance of a gift that comes from elsewhere, from somewhere else that can't be fully accounted for. This, I think, is what makes poetry the first art, that is to say, the paradigmatic art form. By paradigm, I mean two things. It's the first art, but also it's the model then of all the acts of making that follow from it, which is why someone who doesn't read a lot of poems but sees Pete Crow Armstrong catch an amazing pop fly in the center field wall at Wrigley Field will say, oh, that was poetry in motion. His act of making, or making the play in this case, was so good that it seems to call back to that paradigm of poetry. You say something nice to your wife on your wedding day, and your new father-in-law comes up to you and says, That was pure poetry. We sense that all our acts of making are looking back at all times to this primordial act of making called poetry, so that, again, even those of us who don't spend much time reading poems, and certainly not spending any time thinking about them, nonetheless have it in the back of our mind that that poetry is sort of the paradigm, the archetype plus the prototype of what it means to make something. And again, it's because it's this union of craft and gift, of active and receptive. I discovered, much to my delight from a classicist friend of mine years ago, that this is precisely the account of the poet that we find in Homer. That in Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey, these are the first texts of classical Greece, that show the poet not as a mere receptive oracle of the Muses, but as one who receives a gift from the Muses, but then also works at his craft, cobbles at his craft, makes his poem using proper technique. So the first step towards defining poetry is to say that poetry is the paradigmatic form of making. But what is it that makes this kind of making distinctive? That is to say, what about this gift, this part the Muses give us, should have led to its being so paradigmatic? Well, there's an easy answer for it, which is one that we can look no further than Horace's Ars Poetica for an answer to. I can guarantee you that even carpenters, even makers of toasters, makers of light bulbs, makers of anything require to some extent a certain degree of inspiration, a certain degree of gift to make their craft. And yet, I like your picnic tables outside very much, but let's say they aren't so good, okay? And yet, you might go outside and sit at a mediocre picnic table and say, well, there are nails sticking out of it, there's splinters in my rear end, but it'll do to eat lunch at, right? It works as a table. At those moments, you really realize that the woodworker who knows how to make a good picnic bench has a gift. But most of the time, we're conscious only of the necessary useful technique at stake. But when it comes to poems, that's not so much the case. Now, I don't want to endorse these statements from the ancient Roman poet Horace, but I will note that at the end of his Ars Poetica, he says mediocrity in poetry will not do. Poetry is either good, great, or it falls to the bottom of the pile. Again, I don't quite endorse that, but I do think that he's pointing out a conspicuous feature or truth about poetry, which is that the works we really love stand out because they seem irradiated with gift. They seem to transcend the sum of their parts and form a whole that's much greater. But again, what within that act of making is so intrinsic to poetry that we would say it's of the essence of poetry? The first place for us to look is, again, at what poems do. The ancient narrative, epic, and dramatic poems of the Greeks were held in the highest regard. And though they had lyric poems, though they had didactic poems, though they had philosophical poems, those poems were what they most respected. And that's a clue to take us a little way down the road toward defining poetry. We should remember the second half of that passage from Diotima, the part the Muses give us, but that's not where she stops. She says poetry is the part the Muses give us with melody and rhythm. In Hesiod's Theogony, where he describes the birth of the gods, he makes a really captivating observation about the 9 muses. Now, as you may know, at least 5 of the muses, of the 9 muses, are actually goddesses over specific arts of poetry. And in fact, you can even make the argument that 7 of them are. And the other 2, music, which for the ancient Greeks always accompanied verse, and then Cleo, history, the muse who remembers the stories. Hesiod tells us in the Theogony that all 9 of those muses, again, 7 of whom are specifically goddesses of different modes of poetry, possibly 7, they're all the children of one mother. Does anybody know the name of the mother? Yeah. Yes, Mnemosyne, memory. Memory is the mother of the muses. You might say, well, thanks for the, ancestry update, but what does this have to do with anything? Think about the human condition. In fact, in the same area, part of the symposium from which I was reading earlier, Diotima tells us what human life is like. Our bodies are perpetually being distended, torn apart, hopefully not too dramatically, by time, right? Body cells, the cells of the body come into being, and then they are sloughed off. At all times, we're like the ship of Theseus, where our parts are being replaced. We say it's my body, but in one sense it's not, because the body that you have today is not the body you'll have tomorrow. I'm getting old, I know all about this. All right. And then Diotima stabs a real knife into the heart. She says it's even true with the mind. You know something one day, you forget it the next. That's why we have horns. That's why we have studies. We study things, because our mind is continuously changing. It is no less subject to the evanescent flow of becoming than the body is. And that's because both body and mind alike are locked here in time. And as St. Augustine will do in the last books of the Confessions, we note that time is a rather evasive riddle, precisely because it's no sooner here than it's gone. It's easier to understand what it means to speak of the past and the future than it is to know what you mean by now. Because we live, as it were, in a razor-thin film of the present, with the past extending behind us and the future still looming before us, but none of it here. Only now is here. With everything subject to this continuous evanescent flow, this continuous movement into oblivion, it is the greatest of gifts that it doesn't have to all go away. But it can only not go away if we have a very specific gift called memory. As the present disappears into the non-being of the past, it could simply disappear. It could be obliterated and oblivious, that is to say, destroyed and forgotten. But because of memory, the past doesn't disappear. The past gathers up like sand in a sandbag. It gathers up grain by grain and accumulates. And as it accumulates, it begins to take on form. This year, this action, this episode, this moment, this day. What I think the Greeks understood, and why they understood that mnemosyne, memory, must be the mother of the muses, is that they recognized that it was only because memory gathered the fleeting grains of time and held them steady within her being and thereby made them permanent, that the Muses could then, this metaphor is going to get really weird here, enter into the storehouse of their mother and retrieve the lost moments of mere chronology and bring it into the world as a fixed and permanent form, the form of a story. What was mere chronology takes on the permanent form of plot. And this is the first thing that we see poetry doing. What would be lost is made permanent, even eternal, by being retrieved from the storehouse of Mnemosyne and being brought into the world and given form by each of the 9 muses. So memory is the first element that's of the essence of this distinct kind of making called poetry. Now, I know what you're thinking. I said making is important to poetry, and I said memory is essential to poetry. And it didn't take you long to realize that both those words start with M. And that is because God has so ordained that the essence of poetry will be defined by words that begin with M and with none others. The greatest philosopher to talk about poetry as the art of memory is probably Aristotle in his Poetics, where he tells us indeed that while verse, he'll say, is essential to poetry, what really gets at the essence of poetry at its most profound level, the form of poetry at its most profound level, is the way in which the poet forms plots out of the materials that have been lost in the past and that would otherwise be lost in the past. And Aristotle does not just make this observation and move on. He, in fact, tells us that this is what makes poetry a graver and more philosophical activity than another kind of event telling called history. Whereas the historian simply recounts what has been and leaves it there like inert grains of sand, the poet takes the past, the grains of the past, and reforms them and gives them permanent, memorable form that moves by the lines of the probable from the particular to the universal, and thereby becomes a way of knowing. So if we were to ask ourselves, or if we were to ask Aristotle, what do you mean that poetry is more philosophical than history? He would say, what I mean is that poetry is a branch of ethics. It teaches one how human actions function and the good and evil characters that are indications or that we can make judgments about through their actions. Aristotle's writing this after his master Plato has written the Symposium and another dialogue called the Phaedrus. So he can't have been unaware that Plato would not have quite accepted this. Because what happens in Plato's Phaedrus? We have Socrates again talking to Phaedrus rather than to Diotima. And after he's given a bad speech about love, where he said that love ruins everything, it'll get you killed, he says, I better make amends. I better recite a retraction to repent to the god love. And he ends up reciting what he calls a palinode, that is to say, a poem of repentance. There's much to be said about the palinode, but I only have time to share one aspect of it with you, and it's this. In the course of the palinode, Plato unfolds the truth about love, but on the way to do it, he also maps out the entirety of reality for his friend Phaedrus. He describes in poetic figures the great place of being above all change. He describes the movement of souls as they circle the heavens, gazing up and contemplating and feeding themselves on the splendor of form, on beauty. And as they descend into the suet dough of the material world and take that blobby stuff and like a centrifuge, draw it out and individuate it and create the stars and the planets and the animals and human beings, even poets. They're sixth ranked for Plato, for Socrates anyhow. And he says to Phaedrus, and speaking of the soul, I cannot define it for you because it would take a god and a long time to do it. One of the most charming expressions ever. A god and a long time. Like, first, to define the soul for you, I'd have to be a divinity. And even then, we'd be here past lunch, you know? It's pretty good. So he says, I'm not a god, and I won't take a long time. Let me tell you what the soul is, Phaedrus. It's a chariot with its charioteer, drawn by two winged horses, one docile, obedient, and good, the other refractory, troublemaking, and vicious. That, Phaedrus, is the soul. You cannot see your soul, even though I know we're all good followers of Thomas Aquinas here, and that we know that the soul is actually on the outside of our body because it's shaping our body. But you can't see the soul directly. The soul is intelligible, but invisible. And yet, and therefore, I should say, what Socrates has done in that moment is for the first time in history called this invisible, intelligible truth down from the place of being into this world of becoming and revealed it to Phaedrus. Here, Phaedrus, is the soul. How has he done it? By way of metaphor, our third M. As I said just a moment ago, in the Palinode, which is a poem, Socrates refers to poets as sixth-rate human beings. It's above tyrants, but I always want to say seventh-rate human beings must be used car salesmen, but I think it's tyrants. And you might say, well, that doesn't really seem like a very flattering image of poetry, of the poet. And you would be right. But what Socrates is critiquing there is the kind of poet that does what Aristotle thinks is so grave and philosophical. He just imitates human action so we can learn what good and evil are and so on and so forth. You know, that's great, but that's just copy work. Look what I just did, Socrates implies. I just used poetic language to call a new truth into the world that you've never seen before, and I showed it to you. And I did it by the power of metaphor. Now, when I use that word metaphor here, I mean it in the broadest possible sense. I mean the whole realm of figurative language, trope and scheme, any use of language that allows the inexpressible to become expressible, the ineffable to become effable, the invisible to be made visible. Socrates and Plato seem not only to think that the true poet can use metaphors, but that by means of metaphors, the true poet is not just an ethical philosopher, but a metaphysician. He teaches us about the very bones of reality. How do I know this? Because Socrates has just done it. But let's go back to Diotima again. The part the Muses give us with melody and rhythm. Something with which I began, I have thus far avoided mentioning. Meter, our fourth M. You might say, well, why is this just tacked on at the end? It seems like it's just being mentioned. No, it's not. We know that in the ancient world, as well as in the modern world, that patterned writing makes it memorable. And that meter made it possible to memorize thousands of lines and recite them with no greater hint or help than needing to find your next metrical foot. Meter is a mnemonic device, that is to say, it's an aid to memory. But think about what meter does. The past is that formless pile of grains in the storehouse of memory. When we retrieve those grains and bring them and give them form and shape, they take on that permanence that the Muses make possible and that the Greeks so rightly revered. And meter is precisely the way to bring form not just to your paragraphs, but to every, and not just even to every sentence, but to every syllable of your expression. And so you might say that not only is meter mnemonic, but it's the deep memory of our race. It's the deep principle that allows what was fleeting and evanescent to take on permanent form. That it can be recited, but also that it can be brought into, through the ears of its auditors, into their souls and to be retained there. Okay, fair enough, one says. So it's helpful. Helps you memorize stuff. Well, this is not all our ancient ancestors perceived. Most people will know the complaints about the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy from Plato's Republic. Not as many people stick around for the other really long dialogue, the Laws, and probably with good reason. It's not quite as sparkling as the Republic, though it is full of good treasures. If you turn to Plato's Laws, you discover something that makes for an interesting contrast with the Republic. So those of you who read the Republic will recall that poetry is mostly discussed under the form of mythos, more than of poiesis by Plato. That is to say, what he's mostly talking about are the stories that are conveyed by poetry, rather than about any formal component of the poetry itself, although those stories are themselves formal because a plot is a form. It's an intelligible whole. We'll leave that aside for the moment. If you look at the Laws, this is the account of poetry that Plato gives there. Young people, being what they are inclined to just kind of jump around. I'm not sure he's like a whole lot more clear than this. I just see these sort of spastic people like pogo sticks going, just randomly going back and forth. He says, and it was because we just do this by nature that we then compose poetry, giving metrical and musical form to language, so as to bring these erratic, arrhythmic pogo stick bounces of young people into order so that they have a form that's called dance. As we burrow into the Laws, we discover that what he's proposing is that the ordering of music, which in that dialogue and elsewhere for Plato is always coupled with the ordering of language into meter. They're inseparable for him. That kind of ordering is not just taking chaotic nature, these erratic, wily teenagers, and getting them to dance, do some ballroom dancing. It's that, but there's more to it. The reason that this is a valuable activity, suggests Plato, is that in doing so, in fashioning poems, in fashioning metrical language, the part the Muses give us with melody and rhythm, in making meter, in doing that, we are discerning the cosmic order, the musica mundana, the music of the world, the music of the spheres, the music of the macrocosm, the cosmos itself, And we are drawing it into the small form of the work itself, the microcosm. And thereby, we are forming the young individual being according to the pattern and order of nature as a whole. We are humanizing them. That's a very ancient observation. It precedes Plato. It goes back to Pythagoras. You see elements of it in other pre-Socratic philosophers. What is it saying? It's saying that metrical order is in fact the first metaphor, the foundational metaphor, whereby the grand and divine order up above is brought into intelligible form for we here down below, and shapes and forms us to its pattern. And so we see, though we weren't looking for it, that there's a certain resemblance to the Holy Trinity in the essence of poetry. That just as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are circumincest, so it turns out that memory and meter and metaphor are bound up in each other. They compenetrate one another and form a single essence. Now, in the ancient world, this essence was mostly on display in narrative poetry. But in the late classical world, in his work on the Trinity, and then also in the Confessions, St. Augustine gave considered thought to one of those four M's I've mentioned tonight, memory. And he noted in the Confessions that memory was like a great treasure house, a storehouse. It's a sign of our participation in eternity, and it's actually the place where we're most likely to find God, by looking inside ourselves rather than out into the world. And then in his work, The Trinity, he'll double down on that. He'll say, how is man imago Dei? How is man the image of God? You say, well, God is one nature, but Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, three persons. And so the human being is one mind, but possesses memory, understanding, and will. This insight of Augustine will have an immense impact on the history of poetry. Because little by little, over the centuries, poets will discover that not only can poetry retell in permanent form the lost tales of memory, but poetry can enter into the depths of the memory, that is to say, the interior of the self, and by the power of metaphor, make vivid and imaginable what was shrouded in the darkness of interiority and inexpressibility. The nature of the soul, the life of the mind, the movements of the heart, which seem so incoherent and inexpressible because of their dazed behavior until they get the right metaphor to express them. And thus it was discovered that the lyric poem, which in the ancient world was a very minor mode of art, was actually a pretty important mode of art. Because it was a technique, an aid to memory that allowed one to enter into the depths of the memory and to give it articulate expression through the use of metaphor and of meter. Well, coming to the end of my time here, I wanted just to share just a few examples of where we might see these four M's operating together. I'll just share what I can without going on too long. First, the art of making. We have the wonderful invocation of Dryden's Aeneid, or Virgil's Aeneid, but here's John Dryden's translation. Arms in the man I sing, who forced by fate and haughty Juno's unrelenting hate, expelled and exiled, left the Trojan shore. Long labors both by sea and land he bore, and in the doubtful war before he won the Latian realm and built the destined town, his banished gods restored to rights divine, and settled sure succession in his line, from whence the race of Alban fathers come, and the long glories of majestic Rome. So far, it's the Cliff Notes version of the poem. But then listen. O Muse, the causes and the crimes relate. What goddess was provoked, and whence her hate? For what offense the queen of heaven began to persecute so brave, so just a man? Involved his anxious life in endless cares, exposed to wants and hurried into wars. Can heavenly minds such high resentment show, or exercise their spite in human woe? So we get there a sense of the muse has to be invoked. First of all, because he's recalling what would otherwise be lost and bringing it into the present, but also because he's not just going to relate what happened, he's going to explore, try to understand it, to enter into the meaning of it. We get a similar invocation of the muse in Milton's Paradise Lost, where it's the heavenly muse, the Holy Spirit. We get one as well in Sir Philip Sidney's first sonnet, Nastrophil and Stella, where he looks all around to try to find ways to express his love for Stella. I'll just give you the last few lines of this. Thus great with child to speak, he's pregnant to say something, and helpless in my throes, he can't figure out how to articulate it. Biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. So you get this sense, the muse here for Sidney, the muse is not something up above, it's something deeply buried within. But you get this sense that the inner mystery of our hearts can't find expression unless it's given to us. Given to us in the sense of we don't earn it, we just feel it, but also given to us in the sense of that we receive it as something that we can't wholly account for. So much for poetry as making. I want to do something, if you don't mind. I think I'm going to end with just one poem from one of my books. Here's a poem that recites or retraces the path that I've just led you through in meter, and gives us a metaphor to explore the nature of memory. It's a poem called Through the Water. It has an epigraph from the great 20th century poet Ivor Winters, which is a note to a sonnet of his called The Castle of Thorns. He must in some way cross or dive under the water, which is the most ancient symbol of the barrier between two worlds, says Ivor Winters. Again, this is a poem called Through the Water, and I can't resist giving you a preface to it. I was commissioned to write this poem by a magazine. They said, we're doing an issue on baptism. Could you write a poem on baptism for us? I said, surely I can do that. Weeks went by, and I missed the deadline. I thought, I feel really bad about this. I've sent them nothing. It was well past the deadline. Then one night, I had come home from the Y and was standing in the shower with water pouring down all over me. That's how you do it. If you're doing it in any other way, you're not taking a shower. And yet I still explain that. Okay. And I suddenly thought, baptism, this drowning of the old life and birth in the new, this passing between two worlds. And here I am, drowning in not my own sweat, but in the water that's getting rid of the sweat. I know what I need to write. Listen for a little Augustine in the beginning here. Far back within the mansion of our thought, we glimpse a lintel with a door that's shut, and through which all our lives would seem to lead, though we feel powerless to say toward what. It is the place where all the shapes we know give way to whispers and a gnawing gut. And so, in childhood, we will duck beneath the waterfall into a hidden cove. In summer pass within a stand of pines, cut off from those bright fields in which we rove, whose needles lay a softening bed of silence, and great boughs tightly weave a sacred grove. When winter settles in, and our sky darkens, we take a trampled path by pond and wood, and find beneath an arch of slumbering thorn stray tufts of fur, a skull stripped of its hood. Then turn and look down through the thickening ice in wonder at the strangeness of the good. And Peter, falling through that plain where he had only cast his nets before, and where behemoth stalked in darkest depths, that sank and sank as if there were no floor. He cried out to the wind and felt a hand that clutched and bore his burden back to shore. We know that we must fall into such waters, must lose ourselves within their breathless power, until we are raised up, hair drenched, eyes stinging, by one who says to us that from this hour we have passed through. We're dead, but have returned, and are a new creation come to flower. I think I'll let that stand as the last bit of evidence for tonight. Thanks.